So now we'll do a brief introduction to MotionGenesis. If we go back to the main web page, we can see that there's this Getting Started link, and here we see many examples of how to use different functionality. You're welcome to explore all of these, but I recommend starting with this file here, which is called Get Started with MotionGenesis. This is a simple 3-page document which shows you many of the basic commands in the program. You can create variables simply by giving them a name and then assigning them a value. So we'll say that the variable named sum is equal to 2 plus 2. And lo and behold, sum equals 4. We can define another variable, which we'll call Fred. So here we're defining Fred as a symbolic expression. So I'm going to jump ahead briefly to vectors. We need to tell MotionGenesis that we want some unit vectors in our world. So we might define, for example, a rigid frame A, which would correspond to this picture here. And what that has done is defined unit vectors AX, AY, and AZ. So next we might want to define a vector V, which is a function of those unit vectors. So again, we must use an angle bracket after the name, and we'll have 2 times AX, 3 times AY, plus 4 times AZ. Similarly, we can define W. And now one thing we might want to do is ask MotionGenesis for the dot product between vector V and vector W. While this Getting Started guide gives us some simple examples, you might be wondering, what are all the commands available in MotionGenesis? It's useful to remember that you can always type into MotionGenesis the word help, and it will show you this long list of all the possible commands. So if we scroll back up, we can see, for example, all the math functions that are defined. And if we're curious how to use any of these functions, we can simply type help followed by the name of the function. So here it shows me that dot requires 2 arguments, which can take on various forms, but the most common will be that both are vectors. And if we simply hit enter again, it shows us several examples, which lay out various use cases that you might want to use. If you want to start over and clear your workspace, you can simply type clear. This is equivalent to restarting the program, so now the program doesn't have any memory of that variable sum, which I declared earlier, or the vector v, which I also declared earlier. As you learn how to use MotionGenesis, it's useful to refer to these 3 PDFs at the bottom of this list. For example, in the PDF on vectors, it gives me tables showing commands and then uses for those commands. So for example, vector operations like cross and dot, operations for position vectors, operations for rotation matrices, getting and setting angular velocity and angular acceleration, setting the translation, velocity, and acceleration of points, and then also things like mass and inertia and other properties. I'm not going to show them all, but the takeaway here is that you should refer to the examples in these documents as well as these examples down here to learn how to use MotionGenesis for the problems that you're solving.